Welcome to part 4 of the C2 development series. In the previous part, we implemented functionality to detect client disconnections and clean up inactive sessions from our session list. Now it is time to tackle one of the most important features of our server, communicating with the client and executing commands. Let's begin by coming over to our client-utils.go file. As I said in the previous episode, in this file we will write functions that perform active interaction with the client. Now it is a time to create a function that executes a command on the victim computer. We will take as parameters a string, which is the command we want to execute, and a connection instance, which is the connection on which we want to execute the command. The function will return the output of the executed command and an error if there is any. Let's start by writing to the connection the same way we did in our sendAliveCheck function. However, now instead of the AliveCheck string, we are going to send our command to the client. Let's return if there was an error, and return the error. If we've reached this code here, this means there was no error writing to the connection. So let's read the output that was sent back to us. We will define a byte slice with a size of 4 megabytes, and we will read the output that the client sent into this byte slice. Now let's follow exactly what happens when we call this execute command function. We send a command to the client via the socket. The client receives this command, it decodes it executes this command and saves the output, and it sends the output back to the server. The server reads the output and stores it in this variable. I hope that made it more clear. Now let's finish our function. Let's check for errors and return the error if there was any. Now let's define another variable which cleans the unused part of this buffer and holds only the output, because the outputs of most commands will not be 4 megabytes long. Now let's return our response message. And nil, there was no error. We now have a function that reaches out to the client and executes a command. Now we can make use of this execute command function and start implementing this interact feature right here. I'll create a new function for it. Let's take an ID, which will be the ID of the session we want to interact with. And let's also include a parameter for our session manager. We are going to need it. Now we need to find the appropriate session given its ID. Thankfully, if you remember, we implemented this exact functionality in our session manager, which is this function here. So let's use it to retrieve our desired connection. Once we have our connection instance, we now need to create another shell that the user can interact with, which is similar to this one here. But now, instead of interacting with the server, it is going to interact with a specific session. We can do that in a similar way we did it here. I'm going to grab this code and use it here as well. This time I'll just call it the command for more clarity. Here, instead of printing just a hashtag for the beginning of the shell, let's print something a bit more descriptive, so it is easier for the C2 operator to know what they're interacting with. For example, when working with a shell here, we can see that we have the current path at which we are. Let's make something similar to improve the shell experience. So we need the current working directory of which our shell is executing. Let's find it by executing the pwd command. I'm using the execute command function that we implemented earlier. I'm also discarding the error, which is not a good practice. I'm doing this because error checks can get a bit repetitive, and I want to focus on the actual interaction logic right now. Feel free to implement the necessary error checks here. Okay, let's now display a better start of the shell. The format here is first we print the session with which we are interacting, and then we print the current working directory at which the shell in this session is executing, and we finish with a $sign, just like it is here. Now again, similar to what we did here, let's switch the command and determine what the user wants to do. Here, except just executing the command, we need to provide our operator with the ability to background this session. If we don't do that, our operator will be stuck with this session and will not be able to return to this C2 shell that we implemented here. So let's define a few possible commands. I actually forgot something very important. Just like we did here, we need to put this switch statement in an infinite loop so that the user can run as much commands as they want. Here I have defined a few possibilities. If no command was entered, we just want to continue and wait for another one. We have help to print the available commands. We have a close functionality to close the current session, which we will implement later, and a background functionality. In order to background the current session, we just need to exit this interact function that we're implementing here, and we can do this by returning. A mistake I made here is I did not add these lines of code in the loop. Let's fix that. This way we are evaluating the current working directory after every command that is executed. If the user changes a directory, the current working directory will change. Also, we of course want to read a new command, not execute just one that was read the first time. Okay, so now in a case that the command that the user input was none of these, we can actually send it to the client and execute it. And of course we can do this with a default of this switch statement. Let's execute the command, store the output in this result variable, and print the result to the user. Now our interact function looks good. It is now time to come to this part of the code here and call it. But before we can call it, we need to retrieve the ID that the user has requested. It would be the second value in this CMD slice, which, if you remember, is the user input. The first value we are switching here with index 0 is the first command, so help, sessions, interact, and so on. The second value with index 1 would be a parameter to a command. If the user is calling interact, the second value should be the ID they want to interact with. So let's grab it and convert it to an integer. If the conversion function returns an error, this means the user most likely provided a value that is not a valid integer. Let's handle this case. And we will call continue on the loop, so we are just requesting the user to input a command again. Let's also handle a case in which the user did not input an ID at all. If the length of the slice is less than 2, this means there is no parameter to the command they called, so we prompt them to specify a parameter. Now let's handle a case where the user provided an ID, but there is no session with such ID. To do this, we need to check if the ID is within the range 0 to the count of the sessions that we have. Finally, if all checks are met, so the user did provide a valid ID, let's call the interact function. And let's pass the ID that we extracted and the session manager instance. Now let's try it out. I'm going to start the server and let's connect the client. Okay, let's check our sessions. We have one session here with ID 0. Let's try and interact with it. As we can see, we get which session we are interacting with and the current working directory of this session. And finally a $, which for some reason went to the next line. Let's try if the shell works. As you can see, commands are executing. Now let's find why this $, is going to the next line. Let's find where we implemented this part of the shell. It was right here, so our new line is appearing exactly in this position here, between the output of the print working directory command that we executed on the client and the $. But as you can see, there is no new line character here, so where is it coming from? It turns out the client is sending us a new line character at the end of the output of each executed command. If we come to the terminal again, we can see that there are two new line characters here. Let me better demonstrate that to you. Let's come to the client and let's print the result before sending it. And let's try it now. Let's list sessions. Let's interact with this one. And as you can see here, at the end of the output of the command, there is actually a new line character. Let's execute something, and as you can see, at the end of the output, there is again a new line character. Whatever we execute, the client is sending that to us with a new line character at the end. That is the reason the $sign is going to the next line, because a new line character is placed exactly here between the current working directory and the $sign. So let's strip the command output to fix this issue. Let's try it out again. Let's list sessions and interact with the one that's with index 0. As you can see this time, the $sign stays on the same line, and we have this nice beginning of our shell. Now if we run commands, you can see there is only one new line here, and it is also more readable. Also, if you noticed, the new line character is gone from here as well. Okay, let's try to background our session. Let's list sessions, let's interact with it again. Seems to be working. Let's connect another one. Try to interact with the first one. As you can see, it is working. Let's background it. Interact with the 0th one, use the help command, seems to be working pretty well. But if you play around a bit with this session, you will quickly find out that there are some very annoying issues for it. For example, let's see what happens if you try to change directory. As you can see, our shell has now stalled. We can't really recover it. Let's try something else. Let's input an invalid command. What will happen? Again, our shell stalls and we can't really recover, though there are definitely some issues that we need to fix with our shell. See you in the next part where we are going to fix these issues.